1873, and Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution of 1789. Maybe the president simply thought those documents were outdated and needed reform, like his healthcare reform, crafted to lower the federal deficit at the expense not of money, but of extermination of lives deemed not worthy of living.
Is critical. A red line for us is we start saying a whole bunch of chemical weapons move.
President Obama won't lead us into a thermonuclear war.
That would change
The essential ingredient for a thermonuclear war, when you look at his actions, his misanthropy, his arrogant and blatant violations of international and constitutional law, is this president. We stand today at a showdown in which the recent bombardment of Gaza, Israel, and the provocation from Turkey's request for the NATO deployment of Patriot 3 anti-aircraft missiles adjacent to Syria's northern border are steps towards a nuclear showdown between the United States and Russia. This is what Obama's controllers want, what he's crazy enough to do. But using Turkey as a lever for all-out chaos in the recent period should be known. Former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, author of both the Kosovo and Iraq interventions, took the occasion of the first live rounds from Syria entering the Turkish border back on April 19, 2012, to reassert his doctrine used by the Bush administration in Iraq and repeated by Obama in Libya.
Responsibility, but not a regret for removing Saddam Hussein. I think he was...
Appearing on CBS April 19th, Blair said of Syria, "Assad has got to go in the end because there's got to be a transition to a proper form of government. Syria is 11% of the population, controlling 100% of the power. That's not going to work long term." With Tony Blair implying outside interference, it was around this time frame that Turkey demanded the use of Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which states an armed attack against one of its members will be considered an attack against all members and allows for the use of armed force. Turkish Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan at the time said, "A country has rights born out of international law against border violations. Also, NATO has responsibilities with regards to Turkey's borders, according to Article 5. Sadly, no mention was made of jihadi groups and radicals who have been supplied with provisions and weapons from Turkey's territory crossing the Syrian border to combat Assad's forces. Nonetheless, these actions coming at the outset from Tony Blair himself should bring anyone to understand that the moves for provocation come from the British. And the recent calls to deploy Patriot 3 missiles that in effect create a 160-kilometer no-fly zone, though they say it doesn't, is just a reassertion of British policy, whose devastating effects in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya combined will be of no match for what could be unleashed very soon. Already, Russia has voiced its concern coming in the context of tensions existing via NATO's deployment of ballistic missile defense systems on its western border. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov voiced, "Our concerns are rooted in the Chekhov's gun syndrome, that says that if a gun appears on stage in the first act, it will definitely fire by the third. Any provocation may trigger a very serious armed conflict. We want to avoid this." During an interview with Voice of Russia, Russian analyst Konstantin Sivkov made the strong remarks of where these little steps are headed. Published on November 24th, he said, "Deploying these missiles in Turkey will be dangerous for Syrian military planes. This is obvious. The lesser obvious thing is that Turkey is getting ready for a war against Syria. If an attack on Syria from the territory of Turkey does take place, this will most likely be an attack not of the Turkish army, but of NATO forces. The Middle East is getting ready for a large-scale battle which will very likely affect the Russian part of the Caucasus, and this in its turn will be reflected in the entirety of Russia." The decision of whether or not these missiles will be deployed is fast approaching. The issue has been raised that the governments who carry these missiles should have the sole power to decide among their elected representation above NATO as to whether or not to authorize their use. But what about the United States? What about a United States under the authority of a man who has already violated war power resolutions and the nation's very constitution to commit the nation to war? Just as the national leaders in the period before World War I, who thought they were doing everything in their power to avoid war while being duped by the British Empire into processes that ran beyond their control, so now, with Obama in office, the likelihood of a thermonuclear exchange will continue to escalate unless he is removed from office.
It's November 25th, Sunday, 2012. I'm Asuka Saito, and this is the LPAC special update on the just concluded Siller Institute conference in Germany titled A New Paradigm for the Survival of Civilization. Today, you will be hearing from Daniel Garznak, who was at this conference. Welcome and good evening, Daniel.
Good evening, Asuka. Thank you very much for having me on.
All right. But before we begin, let me give a brief update on the transatlantic situation, because this conference is organized as a direct intervention into this highly volatile situation. In Turkey, the development of the Patriot missile is expected to be approved by NATO as early as this week. But within the last 24 hours, it was reported that NATO's surveillance aircraft, AWACS, is likely to be deployed into Turkey as well. And as a top-level officials from Russia are warning that these moves by NATO outside of the UN Security Council is used as a pretext for establishing a no-fly zone. Now remember, in the case of Libya, that after NATO's approval of no-fly zone, it took only 3 days for them to begin airstrikes against Libya. And also the tension between Israel and Hamas is higher than ever, despite the ceasefire between the two last week. It is widely known within the intelligence community that the Israeli attack against Gaza was only a practice run for an armed confrontation with Iran. But all these drive toward war on the other side is fueled by an accelerated economic collapse centered in the transatlantic region. Now, that situation is typified in Greece, where youth unemployment is over 50%, 440,000 children suffering from malnutrition. Electricity is being cut off from 30,000 families per month, and almost a 40% increase in suicide rate since 2009. And these are the real humanitarian crises happening not only in Greece, but you can see that all over the transatlantic region. Add to this the fact that there is a total vacuum of leadership right now, as we've witnessed last week yet another failed EU summit, where all the participants agreed to go with austerity measures, meaning mass murder, but failed to agree on how. And this is where I would like to hand over to Daniel to give us a report on the Siller Institute conference in Germany, to give our audience a new insight into the whole situation. So Daniel, can you just give us an overview of this conference?
Right. Well, one can state, for starters, that this was an extremely short-term emergency conference, which really came into being over the course of less than 6 weeks. And in view of this, the participation, the level of participation from diplomats, from think tank representatives, professors, was quite outstanding. And you mentioned the title, A New Paradigm for the Survival of Civilization, and it's really only through the top-down approach that Lyndon LaRouche and the LaRouche movement take to history and to the development of mankind that allows people to put all the aspects of the current crisis and also the solution thereto in a single concept, as an idea thought that can be wielded and implemented. And one can really say that throughout this entire conference, the tension and the urgency for the implementation of the kinds of development projects and space exploration projects which do comprise or do represent the common aims of mankind, as Edward Teller called them, couldn't be the more clear. We had especially a special focus in this conference on the fact that peace can only come through development. Peace through development has been the motto of our movement since its inception, basically. And this is totally in contrary to the way that the British Empire insists upon political manipulations and conflicts, and insists that peace must come first, and then you can talk about projects and development and building things. And every time that approach is taken, mankind has taken another further step toward chaos. So in general, it was a very complete picture of what's required, because obviously you only really get to the question of the necessity of development, even, and for space exploration, once it's clear in your mind what man is, what makes us different from the beasts. What is it that makes human life sacred and makes it our highest obligation to make sure that not only are people not killed, but that the kind of menticide and attack on the human mind that popular culture, as devised by the minions of the British Empire, effects, that is overcome through a real renaissance of creativity and of the kind of passion that all the individuals in history that have brought mankind a step further conceptually have demonstrated. And I think this conference will really change the way that we act. And I think everybody listening can ready themselves mentally to work through the material presented in its entirety at this conference.
Right. Now, for our viewers, I want to point out that we will be publishing on our website the presentations made at the conference soon. So definitely stay tuned for that. But the range of topics discussed at this conference is very unique. So I want, Daniel, you to go through some of the program and some of the ideas presented at this conference, and also give our viewers sort of a foretaste of who were among the circles brought together for this occasion.
Gladly. I mean, in general, the conference was arranged into several panels. It was conceptually very thoroughly composed. It began with a razor-sharp briefing of the type that Mrs. Tsepp-LaRouche is very well known to give. And the first panel dealt with the greater Middle East and the trigger for World War III being pulled there. And we had the ambassador to the Islamic Republic of Iran to Germany was there. We had Hussein Austerity, the chairman of the EAP in Sweden, the LaRouche movement in Sweden. Together with the two speakers after the lunch break, Professor Taham from the Lycée Henri IV in France, and Mrs. Tasmini from Lisbon. It became clear to the audience after this whole development that what they think the conflict is about is wrong. What the media presents has got nothing to do with what it's really about. And I don't even mean that people don't know